So, first of all, thank you, David. It was great to have Professor David Labaree here, professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, and also professor of history there, and noted scholar in the history of education, with a number of books, and books with titles that make the rest of us envious. Most recently, Someone Has to Fail. Before that, How to Succeed in School Without Really Learning. Those are my favorite titles, and portrays a wonderful edge. And probably most significant, though, about you, in addition to small honors like being president of the History of Education Society and other matters, is that you originally were a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. So I just think that needs to get noted. So
yes.
So thank you for your time, and thanks for participating in this. So you've written broadly about a number of things, and have a keen eye, I think, for various tensions that you've indicated inside of history of U.S. education. And as we try to understand through this project, to try to get some historical perspective on current issues in school reform and schooling in the U.S. I want to sort of get the benefit of some of those tensions. You have a great line in I think your most recent book about maybe we should prefer hustlers over scholars, and it seemed to point to some tensions about directions and purpose, and I'm wondering if you might be able to help us understand that.
Sure, thanks. What I was talking about is the current accountability movement, No Child Left Behind, and all of the things coming out of OECD and so on, are heavily focused on learning the formal curriculum in schools at a certain high level of achievement. This is set up as the primary goal of schooling and the way to test whether schools and teachers are good or not. And for me, as a historian, I look at that, and that's a really new development. The history of schooling in the U.S. has been one where there's been remarkably little interest in measuring the extent to which people learn the formal curriculum. We always had a formal curriculum, but it was never standardized. Every school district had its own, and there were no output tests. The idea was that, yeah, you studied this stuff, but in my view, what was more important in more recent years is that it's not obvious to me how important it is to be learning algebra at a certain level, or plane geometry, or studying poetry, and what connection that has with improving the economic productivity of a society. And so, to me, when I look at some of the benefits of the American system, one of them is that it hasn't been focused very much on the formal curriculum. We haven't had particularly high standards. Getting into school and graduating from school has never been a difficult problem. Getting promoted has never been terribly difficult. But what schools teach is how to do school. They're really good at that. And in the process of doing school, and I'm thinking particularly of high school now, students learn a lot of interesting skills. They learn, for example, how to meet the formal requirements of their job, in this case being a student, without letting those requirements impinge too much on their lives. That's a useful thing when you're working in bureaucratic roles or something, or else. You know how to satisfy the boss like you satisfy the teacher, and to do it with half your brain tied behind your back. And then you invest your energies in things that you find more interesting, like the extracurriculars that people despise so much in schools. But to me, is where a lot of the great learning comes. That's where you learn leadership skills. That's how you learn how to cooperate. That's how you learn how to pursue things you care about instead of just following directions. It's where you pick up a lot of social skills and understand the soft skills that are involved in working with other people, establishing yourself within hierarchies, and handling the politics with peer groups and organizations that you belong to. To me, that is great training for an adult in a modern society and in the workplace. And so the fear is this, that we the 20th century was a time when the American schools didn't focus very much on learning the school curriculum. And it was a spectacularly successful century economically for this country. Now we're pushing hard to learn the school curriculum for the first time. And that could ruin everything. You know, it could it could just upset the whole story. It could cramp people's style in doing the extracurriculars that have maybe been the most important part of school. Now they're going to be studying all the time. I mean, who wants that?
Hmm. How do you, I love that thesis. I mean, I think it's a striking one. I have a daughter in high school, so I'm trying to not overly personalize my interpretation of what she's doing and how she's spending her time. But tell me how you see this playing out in the very different school settings in the U.S. So you have some, and I'm sure in the neighborhood of your university, that are very much on the track of beating whoever is in the lead this month, Finland or Hong Kong or somebody, and so forth, and figuring out how many minutes, as you referred to that documentary about the numbers of, I forget how many it was. Is it 2 million? 2 million minutes? Or,
yeah, that's right.
That people spend on these things. Do you see? So, is it that group? Is it others that have too much time for extracurricular? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I mean, the issue is, it's such a stratified system. We have, I mean, I live in Palo Alto, which has this extremely high-powered school system filled with professors' kids and Silicon Valley families' kids, and their only choice is whether they're going to go to Berkeley or Stanford, but nothing else really counts. And so, in that kind of setting, it's very different from what it is if you go over to East Palo Alto, which is a largely minority community, and where people's social chances are not guaranteed at birth, and where schooling is not the way to sort of hold on to what you have, which is the way it works in Palo Alto. It's the way you get access to parts of society that you currently don't have. It's the way parents hope that schools are going to give their kids the opportunities that the parents didn't have. And so the combination is really interesting to me because you look at that. On one side, school is the zone of advantage. It's the zone of access. It's the place for people who are outside to get inside, people at the bottom to move up. It's always played that role. It's part of the romance of education that it's kind of, if you want to get a good job, get a good education. And that model is still true. On the other hand, for people in places like Palo Alto, education plays a very different role. They're already in a great position. These are all upper middle class families. And their children, their parents are well educated, and for them, schools are a place to hold on to advantage. They're a place to secure their positions, and they're concerned about that because one of the peculiar things about modern societies is that as a family, you can pass on money to your children, but you cannot pass on an occupational position. To get a job, you need in a modern society, educational credentials. And so it's maybe the reason that upper middle class families seem so obsessed about education, because the only way they can pass advantage on to their children is to give them advantaged education. So the first thing you do is you buy a house in a town like this where the average house costs $1 million for 1,500 square feet. You're going to get a good school system when you move into a system like that. And then you start plotting the next step. What kind you need to get into a selective university. And then after that, you probably need to get into a selective graduate school. So for this group, education is the way to try to preserve advantage. While across the tracks in East Palo Alto, it's the place to get entry. It serves both functions at the same time. They're contradictory. One's opening up possibilities, and the other is icing advantage. It does both. That's one of the reasons the system is so complex and in some ways looks rather muddled, because it's got within it a set of contradictory aims that it's trying to simultaneously satisfy.
You've I love the expression recently of the glass floor. of trying to make sure your kids don't fall through that,
Yeah,
and just
yeah.
do whatever you can to bump them, at least to keep above a certain level and so forth, in terms
Watch
of
out for
preservation.
your daughter. Got to keep.
That's right.
Have you
That's
taken
right.
her on the college tour yet?
That's soon. That's soon. Exactly.
Soon, yeah. So
Which seems to start in fifth grade these days. So
it
I love
does.
it.
Yeah, it used
Yeah,
to be 11th grade, and now it's a lot earlier.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Um, but when you talk about this, so this is really this either preserving or gaining access to the goods of society as a part of this goal of really of either maintaining or preserve or getting some kind of mobility socially.
Yeah.
And you've talked about these in terms of these competing principle, these competing purposes that we have for the system and why it sort of has built-in contradictions. But you've also talked about how these purposes have changed historically, or the mix at least. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you see that playing out over time, and where you would locate current reform efforts in that mix of purposes.
Sure. The American school system did not start out as a place to provide people with access and advantage. That was the last thing on the minds of its founders. So the common school movement emerged in the 1830s and 40s in the U.S. across the country, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. And the aim there, like the aim basically in countries around the world that established universal schooling systems, like our own common school movement did, the aim was to basically establish the basis for a nation state. I mean, the school is in some ways the core institution of a modern society uh, where you're shifting from a system where people are subjects of the crown to people where people are citizens of a nation. And the school is a central institution for trying to turn subjects into citizens, to try to create, in the case of the U.S., a republican community of people that are civic-minded and are willing to support the common good in the republic. And in the early part of the 19th century, that was a real threatening possibility. The republic was very new. The history of republics is they don't last long. In world history, they tend to turn into tyranny as sort of the rich and powerful take over. And the founders were worried about that. Schools were one of the answers, and one of the things that spurred the school was the rise of a very rapidly expanding market economy in the 20s and 30s, 1820s and 30s. So you had a lot of new wealth, you had a lot of entrepreneurial behavior, you had a lot of self-interested action going on, which in the terms of Republican history is antithetical. It undercuts people's civic virtue. So how do you put those two together? The answer was the common school. You bring everybody together into one room. You provide them with a common experience, and in the process, and the founders were very clear about this, you try to instill in them a sense of themselves as citizens and their need to serve the public good. That's where we started. It was a purely political plan. There was no sense that this was going to have economic benefits. That all emerged later.
Mm-hmm. And where would you put it now?
Well, I mean, I think what happens is something very interesting. And you look at the start of the common school system, and look at the practical problem. You had to, there were already people going to school, but before the common school, but middle-class families paid for their own at private schools. And there were public schools, but they were pauper schools. You had to go down to City Hall and declare yourself indigent, and then they would allow you to go to a public school at no expense. So if you're trying to set up a universal school system, a universal public school system, you've got a problem. Public schooling is stigmatized. It's poor people's school. So how do you attract middle-class families to join a stigmatized school system when they already have a viable alternative? And so what you see, I studied this in Philadelphia, but you see parallel issues later elsewhere. A key element was in Philadelphia, they built a humongous high school with marble facade and Greek columns and a German telescope, and the teachers called professors, and they were authorized to grant college degrees. This was a fabulous place. It was better than any private school. It was better than a lot of colleges in the area, including Penn, I might add. And so what they said is, this is great, it's going to be free, but the only way you can get in is by sending your children to the common schools first. First 1 year, then 2 years. So the idea is, if you want this very special kind of education, you've got to join the public schools. It worked. People joined. But notice they joined in a very interesting situation. The only way to establish a common school system was by establishing an uncommon school, a high school, to attract those who already had advantage into a system that otherwise seemed to be aimed only at people who wanted access. And so over time, you find that same kind of process going on. What happens at the end of the 19th century? You find that the public schools, the elementary schools, were filling up. By 1900, the average person of school age had already attended 8 years of school. Where's the next place to get educational access? It's through the high school, which at that point was a very scarce good. So we started expanding the enrollment in high schools at very large levels. Well, if you've been getting social advantage from attending high school, as they did for the 19th century, what's a middle-class family to do? Well, two things happened to preserve that edge that they had. One is that we tracked our high schools. So they let newcomers in, but they came in the lower tracks. The middle-class kids were in the academic track. And secondly, the ones in the academic track also started to go to college in large numbers. This is when college started to become the middle-class zone of advantage. So you end up, you've raised the floor here. Now you have a bunch of working-class kids attending high school, which is a huge opportunity and access for them. But at the same time, you've stratified that zone and you've raised the ceiling, where the middle-class kids are now going to college. You see the same thing happening in the middle of the 20th century when high schools filled up. And after the Second World War, the zone of advantage was clearly college. We had a huge expansion of college enrollments. College is now approaching a universal model of schooling. And so what happened? The newcomers went into the lower track colleges, which were the zones of expansion: community colleges, urban colleges, regional state universities, not to the high level institutions that have been around all along. So you have tracking, and then at the same time, what happens to middle class families? College is no longer very special, everybody's going to it, so they start going to graduate school. So once again, the floor goes up, the ceiling goes up, and we stratify the middle. That's been a pattern for a very long time, and it seems to have, it keeps responding to these multiple pressures. We've got to keep giving people more access, because in a democracy, it's hard to deny access to a public institution if a lot of people want it. On the other hand, we preserve advantage through tracking and raising the ceiling. It's hard to know how you would politically stop a situation like that without radically impinging on people's rights.
And yet, part of this also seems interesting in that there's differential access also obviously around boundaries that people are within, whether it's you talk about sort of geographic and racial and other kinds of boundaries in which that access and advantage seems either frustrated or facilitated.
Right.
But maybe a different direction slightly. The part of what it seems as you talk about this, the 19th century in the rise of the common school movement, that this is at a time when that one of the hallmarks of the U.S. approach had been that it moved quicker and faster to a common schooling system than other countries, at least other European countries and others, and that had various kinds of consequences. I was wondering if you would maybe share a little bit. What does that mean for? Are there any legacies to that that we're living with today?
Yeah, it's a very interesting model because you look at it, the universal schooling came very early in the United States uh, and in the early 19th century. And then it expanded even earlier, expanded to the high school level. So the expansion at the end of the 19th century was really unprecedented. I mean, in Britain, the expansion of secondary education didn't really happen in a major way until after the Second World War. So here we were half a century ahead with a huge increase in high school attendance. After 1890, enrollments doubled every decade for the next 50 years. It was an amazing expansion. And so, how do you explain that? Why would this country invest so much in education so early? And the best argument I've found, and I sort of picked this up from European colleagues, is that comparative perspective helps. The European model in like the second half of the 19th century, you think about Germany under Bismarck and Britain under Disraeli, the period of how do we accommodate a rising working class and create some sort of equitable social order. And the way that Germany and Britain and other European countries dealt with that was by creating a social safety net. They started creating the very beginnings of a welfare state. So the way in which we sort of take care of people and keep them from revolting is by saying, look, if you get out of work, we'll help you. There are going to be some pensions for people who are old. There are other ways of trying to maintain so that being at the bottom of the system was not a horrible situation. It was sustainable. In the U.S., the model was very different. This is, in many ways, the most liberal of liberal democracies. Americans have always been suspicious of social democracy that focuses on trying to preserve and preordain social outcomes for people. And so we're radically individualistic. We tend to think about issues of people should get what they deserve based on their efforts and their smarts and so on. So the American response was, we're not going to provide the safety net, which we really didn't start doing until the New Deal. We're going to provide people with educational opportunity. Now, we're going to give them the at public expense the chance to come into this institution and show what they can do. It's a meritocratic place. If they work hard, if they study hard, they play hard, they follow the rules, they show their smarts, they're going to move through the system and through their educational credentials earn a good job. If they don't work hard, if they drop out, if they get into trouble, then they're not going to get the good jobs and they get what they deserve. So the issue is we're more interested in providing equal opportunity for getting ahead through schooling than we are to try to level the playing field at the bottom of the system and raise the floor and keep people comfortable who are not succeeding well. It's a very different philosophy, and schools end up being incredibly central to that. Schools are basically our welfare program. That's the way in which we see ourselves as taking care of everybody. It's one of the reasons in the U.S. schools seem to be the answer to every problem that comes in. We kind of educationalize social problems because schools are the way that we take care of these issues. It's how we deal with race. It's how we deal with inequality. It's how we deal with a declining economy. Schools are the way to do it, and they've been more central in that sense in American life than they have, say, in European life.
Why do you think that's the case? Why do we educationalize our social issues?
Well, I mean, as part, I think it's just the American suspicion of the state, the American concern about individual liberty, the American worry about anybody telling them what to do. And so the state is a last resort. It's not, look at the most recent election, it's not everybody's, a good way to get elected is to say you're against Washington and you're against the government. So that's been a standard trope for a long time in American politics. And so schools enter into that place as one legitimate place that we can do what in other countries would be called a welfare program. We're going to take care of people, but schools have to take care of them in a way that basically gives them opportunities, and then the individual has to take care of herself. That's it. We give you the chance, and then it's up to you. And if you don't take advantage of it, it's your problem. And in the end, people who move up or move down get what they deserve, and schools are the arbitrator of that. We put huge reliance on them. It's at the very center of the legitimacy of our society. It's not a legitimate thing to have radical inequality as we have unless we feel comfortable that everybody had a fair shot and that schools are the place that give them the fair shot. And since they do that, then we can live with it. We can live with the unequal outcomes. And we aren't that concerned about helping to raise the floor.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reminds me of the comment from our late colleague Michael Katz a few years ago that your achievement scores have now become the way to distinguish the deserving and the undeserving poor.
Yes, he's doing some great work about that, but that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you talked a bit about the sort of the or you in some of your writings as well, but you mentioned it earlier in the sense of people's as the consumers of this service around schools. They have certain goals that they have for themselves in terms of advancement and everything else, and that there was this era, the common schools, where that this push on really what was a political agenda, and I'm wondering, in light of the very individualized kinds of approaches that were happening before the common schools, and then the at least the policy rhetoric that we have today about the kind of choices that we're supposed to be proliferating for schooling as well. Is there something about this common school system in the middle that is an exception? That is a time period in which the fears of either regional division, of urbanization, of massive immigration, and so forth, overwhelmed the personal, or at least caused it to be scary enough that we would want to go under a common banner, but that the general rule is that when that subsides, we're willing to go individual. I'm just wondering how you see that in that wider frame.
I really like that. Yeah, I think there's something to that.
I'm stealing a chunk of this from Nancy Beattie, by the way. So I'm just want to be.
Good.
I think I see some of that in her work. So
yeah, I plagiarize from her all the time. But I think you're right. In some ways, the norm in American life and American educational life has been the individual consumer is doing this for him or herself, and the state plays a background role. And it seems like the state in American life becomes very prominent only in a crisis situation. And one crisis was a huge crisis at the beginning, in the first and second quarter of the 19th century is the Republic going to last? And in particular, can the Republic coexist with a rapidly expanding and rather rapacious free market economy? How can you have civic virtue and the radical pursuit of individual interest in the same place? And so the school was supposed to solve that problem. In my view, I think it did. It did by getting schools people internalize the civic virtue, and then they can regulate themselves, become actors in the marketplace without losing their dedication to the Republic. That was the kind of model. That's a very political model. It's one that's very government-centered. But once the crisis fades, I think we revert to the mean, and the mean is it's everybody for yourself. As I said, you set up this high school, it's a distinctive place, and suddenly the high school becomes an object of competition. Everybody wants to get in because it's the advantageous place to be. And so that kind of consumer-driven behavior, I think, has been the norm ever since. I mean, I ended up writing, my last book was supposed to be about the history of school reform, and what I found out was that school reform was not terribly relevant. If you want to understand how the school system changed, reformers were not it. Reformers got the system started. That was the only successful school reform, in my view, the common school movement. But You look at the growth of high schools, there was no movement at the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. There was no manifesto, no committee of 10 that was proposing we need to have everybody go to high school. It was consumer driven. Working class families saw this as a real opportunity. Their kids had already completed grammar school, the only place to get social advantage in American life, and the only institution that could grant it is the school, and in this case, the high school. So the ban came from the bottom. It was not a top-down, but a bottom-up reform. Same happened with the expansion of higher education. And so you find that I think another example of this is the Second World War and the Cold War. I've just finished writing something about this, and that is it was the only period in American life where government really seriously, especially the federal government, thought that higher education was a serious public good that needed public support. Why? Because of the threat of the World War, followed by the threat of nuclear annihilation that lasted for 30 years. And so we had a huge investment in higher education, a huge government investment. And since then, what have we seen? Backing down, tax revolts, declining state contributions to higher education. The federal role is shifted from grants to loans. Why? Because the default position is higher education is a way for individuals to get ahead. If they're going to get the advantage from that, they should pay the cost. So why is that a state function? So to me, it's kind of like we keep reverting to the mean, and the mean is that this is an individual issue. Schools are something that individuals demand, individuals benefit from, and the role of the state is basically supply consumers with what they want, but to pass as much of the cost on as they can.
Mm-hmm. So where would you then locate if we think of the current trifecta around reform of higher standards through the Common Core, a schema of accountability largely is on a whole system of assessment of student performance, and increasing support for new choices in schooling options in providers.
School choice.
Yeah, school choice along those lines. How do you locate that then in this wider narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. To me, I really find that whole accountability trifecta rather scary. And what's scary is that it's really new. The best thing about the history of school reform is that reformers have generally been pretty ineffectual. Thank God for that. You know, I'm glad the administrative progressives didn't get their way. It would have been ugly. We would have all been attending vocational schools. And so the happy news about the school reform is that it usually didn't work, and the main driver was consumers. The problem is that the accountability movement has really learned from those failures, and I'm fearful that it might actually work. And that makes me nervous because they're really serious about pushing the idea that learning school subjects, especially really 4 school subjects, nothing else really counts, at a high level is the thing that matters. And that radical narrowing of the school experience, I think, could be very destructive. They've also learned that how to deal with the loose coupling of the American school system, where state systems are cut off from the federal government, local systems are cut off from the state. Schools are in some ways independent of the district, and classrooms are independent of the school. There's a kind of nested quality where it's very hard to move from one layer to another, and especially to move a reform down through the system and out through all of the horizontal reaches of the system. And so the accountability system has really come with a way to tighten up that the coupling by setting standard curriculum standards, coupling them with high stakes tests, and then reinforcing that with things like value-added measures of teaching effectiveness about how well they raise test scores of their students. That's suddenly putting everybody on notice that teachers and students and administrators now have to focus on this one issue. They don't have the kind of autonomy they used to have. They have trouble. You used to be able, a teacher could close the classroom door and do what you wanted. Nobody really kind of knew. Now you do. The consequences are terrible, not just for the teacher, but for the student. And so in that case, what makes me nervous is they're really changing things. They're really working their way into the heart of schooling, the teaching and learning in classrooms. And no reform has really been successful in penetrating the classroom before. These guys are good at it. They make me nervous.
It's always interesting to have somebody celebrate the failures of school reform, but it would seem that one of the other keys, though, in this current situation, and I'm wondering how you see it, is the role. It's not new that there are philanthropists involved in education.
Right.
It seems newer. I can think of some sort of, I don't know, associations of manufacturers and others in different eras in which there was some kinds of colluding, but it seems a much more coordinated approach. It seems to have a similar songbook and a much greater percent of ability to affect resources, leverage resources and have resources, and an attention to institution building that will support this. And I'm just wondering, is this a fair impression? Is that new?
Yeah, that is new. It really is new. And it's one of the reasons I think it's working. Again, because of suspicion with government, somehow reforms for Americans are more credible if they're coming from quasi-independent locations, non-governmental organizations. And it's interesting to watch how a lot of these reforms around standards started out outside the system and gradually moved their way into government. It would have been difficult for government to initiate it right away, but if it comes in sideways, it's more acceptable. But as you point out, what are these nonprofits? They are not disinterested observers. And if we're talking about an accountability movement, those philanthropists are not accountable. Nobody elected them, but they're pushing an agenda very effectively. And the size is just enormous. I mean, it used to, when I was growing up, the big foundations were things like Carnegie and Ford, and they're minuscule compared to something like the Gates Foundation. And so, the scope of money and effort they can put in, and the way in which they can use money to draw people toward the kind of reforms they want is really quite remarkable, especially for school systems that are always short of funds. Since we always underfund public institutions, money coming from the outside is fabulous, and the strings attached don't look that onerous. But it makes me nervous because it seems like it's another kind of undemocratic process for reshaping public schools that are at least nominally under public control.
And the fact that it seems that part of the attack, if you will, or reform, however one wants to put it, has been quite intentional in indicating, I think back to the work of Chubb and Moe and others early on, that actually the democratic governance of it is part of the problem. I say that knowing that I look forward to working with John as in his new role as president of the National Association of Independent Schools, which seems an appropriate place for somebody who is arguing for a different kind of governance structure. But
I'm an independent school myself for high school, so I'm another one of the guilty.
Right. No, and my daughter is in an independent school, so it's all full disclosure on that. So let me shift if I can, because you've also written on something quite close to home, and that is about ed schools. So in the mix of all this, and particularly in sort of the current shifts around reform, current challenges to the professions, the rise of a variety of institutions, if you will, in the landscape around both recruiting and preparing and supporting and representing and advocating for professionals in this space of education. Where do you've indicated some of the challenges that ed schools have had over time, and I'm also wondering what you see as their particular role, their possibilities, how you might differentiate that by type, thoughts that you might have around ed schools in this current context.
Yeah, big question. I wrote a book about it.
Yes.
I mean, ed schools have been in a really odd position in American life. They started really outside of higher education entirely in the 19th century when we had normal schools that were initially more like high schools. They were schools for training teachers, most of them public, some private. And universities by the turn of the century started developing a small education department, maybe for training secondary teachers and administrators. But in general, the university ignored education as an issue. But these normal schools, again, through consumer demand, tend to grow into bigger institutions. A lot of people saw them not as a place to become a teacher, but as the most accessible, cheapest, and geographically nearby institution of higher education. So they started going there to get educational opportunity, as Americans always have. And going to the state university was a harder thing and more expensive and farther away. The normal school was closer by. And they didn't want just a high school education. They wanted a college education. So normal schools started to evolve into teachers' colleges, giving bachelor's degrees. And that still wasn't enough because the university was now the attractive model in the 20th century. So what do we see? We see teachers' colleges gradually, by the 1930s or so, changing their names and just calling themselves ex-state university instead of ex-state teachers' college. State college, excuse me. They initially called themselves colleges, and then by the 1960s or so, they were universities. So if you look at Michigan, for example, Eastern, Western, Central, and Northern Michigan University were all normal schools originally, and now they're regional state universities. In California, the entire California State University system basically started out, most of those campuses started out as normal schools or teachers' colleges. So the education ended up in higher education through the back door. It wasn't there at the beginning. It's kind of an interloper. And so it doesn't have the same feel as the other professional schools that were there all along. And on top of that, it had a, in some ways, deserved reputation of being intellectually undistinguished. It was easy. They were producing huge numbers of teachers, so getting into education was not hard. Graduating was not hard. You had to do a quick program because there was a lot of turnover, and we needed to keep turning people out. So that's not a way of developing a reputation for being high standards when you seem to be an open access unit with low standards. And on top of that, professional schools tend to get a lot of their prestige from the profession they're connected with and the clients they work with. And in education, that was a problem. Teachers there 4 million of them in the United States right now. It's not exactly an elite profession. It's a mass occupation at one level. Unlike other professionals, they are public servants, not fee-for-service independent actors. We've never looked kindly on public servants as being, this is again a suspicion of government. Government workers are seen as lowly, and they work with little kids. They don't work with adults, and they work with little kids from the other side of the tracks, whereas professionals tend to focus maybe more on the washed rather than the unwashed. And so you add it all together, it's not a great way to gain respect. Within most universities, you find a high degree of scorn toward education even now. My first day at work at Stanford when I moved here from Michigan State University. I saw um, outside the education building was a sign written in chalk on the sidewalk, and it said education building with a sign, with an arrow pointing toward it, and education was spelled Edukashun. So you can't get no respect,
Right.
really. And so it is something that's been a problem over the years, and it's one of the problems with school reform is that the role that education professors play in it is they play a role, but they aren't seen as terribly credible. The more credible reformers typically come from somewhere else, from like the real disciplines, not the education school. And so the kind of role we can play is not particularly powerful, and the kind of voice we have is not necessarily seen as very credible.
David, you've been very generous with your time. Are there any other thoughts that you would want to share with those thinking about schooling and school reform in the U.S.?
Well, I would be saying, and it's something I tell my students, is all of my students want to fix the system. They want to fix schooling in order to make a better life for everybody, which is a great goal. But number one, school may be the worst possible way to affect serious social change. So if you want to equalize, to make the society more equal, less unequal, giving people more schooling has no effect on that at all. It just affects who's in what position in an unequal society. If you want to do that, you can do it through the political system and redistribute wealth, but that's certainly not something we're doing. So schools in that sense are not a particularly great way of pursuing social change. And number two, the people jump in and try to change the system before understanding it. I think the key thing is to try to understand it first, because otherwise you tend to make things worse. Elmore and McLaughlin wrote a lovely monograph a few years ago called Steady Work, which was about school reform. It's steady work in part because every time you change part of the system, you create new problems and somebody else has to come in and fix those. So I'm trying to encourage my students to not be the problem. And to be a little cautious, be a little humble. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the system's more complicated than I thought. Maybe the side effects of this are going to be worse than the main effects. And the other I want to encourage them to think about is in studying the system, I've developed a kind of sneaking respect for it. Not that I love its outcomes, but I find it just remarkable that this institution has been able to manage the contradictory aims that people push on it, and all of the actors within it that are seeking to use it for their own purposes, and somehow it manages to provide both access and advantage, and it has for a very long time. This is an incredibly stable society, and one of the reasons is that the educational system has been responsive. Every time people want more access, it gives them more access. Not to social positions, but to more education. Every time people want to preserve advantage, school provides that. So it's doing what we want in a lot of ways, even if we don't like the outcome. It depends on where you stand, how you see the outcome. But to me, you got to sort of understand that this has been an incredibly successful system. It started at tiny, marginal, and informal, and now it stands at the very center of American social life. It eats up 12, 16, 20 years of people's lives. It transforms families into servants of the school for a good part of their lives. It's, you look at it in those terms, it's an astonishingly successful institution. It's hard to picture in terms of sheer growth, size, number of people, and funding. Is there a more successful institution? I don't know if I can think of it. So is it a failure? Well, I don't know. It looks like a success from that stage. And so I think developing a little respect for it and understanding its dynamism is important for anybody that wants to try to change it.
That's a fantastic summary. Thank you. No, thank you so much for your time for contributing to this. I really, it's funny because I feel I started into to looking at history of it through Larry Kremet,
Oh, great. Yeah.
and I've not done justice to his tutelage at all. But I mean, I think he had that kind of respect for the complexity of the system,
Yeah.
as well as extending it to beyond schooling and so forth, which he did so well. But that that its constant adaptation
Yeah.
is remarkable. And in some ways, maybe it embodies, because to go full circle to our conversation, it embodies the system itself is hustling
Yeah.
rather than being scholarly. Were the system more scholarly, it would never hustle to adjust the way it does.
Excellent. I like that. Very good. I'll steal that. If you
Please
don't
do.
mind.
Please do. Please do.
Good.